Now that we have the main part of the quilt put together, it's time to add the side borders. Before cutting, we need to do a couple important steps first. Laying the center of your quilt out on a flat surface, carefully measure from top to bottom in 3 different places, one on each side and down the middle, and write down your measurement. And you're going to repeat the same process from side to side, at the top, the middle, and the bottom. If we were measuring this unquilted, your measurement should be 50 by 50. However, because we've pre-quilted it, that has drawn your fabric in some. I came out with a 49-inch square. So whatever measurement you come up with, that's what we're going to use for your strips. At this point, we're ready to start cutting our strips. We need 3 1.5-inch strips cut from color A and B, and that's times the width of the fabric. You need 3 4-inch strips from the backing fabric. In addition to that, you will also need 2 4-inch strips from your batting times the length of your side, whatever measurement you came out with. After you get your strip cut, take one of each fabric A, B, and your backing fabric and cut those strips in half lengthwise. You are then going to piece those together to the remaining longer strips so that you'll have strips long enough for your sides. Repeat that process with the other set of strips. To make the most unnoticeable seaming in these strips, lay your pieces perpendicular to each other, aligning the corners. Now draw a chalk line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. This will be your stitching line. Stitch on this line and then trim off all but 1/4 inch of the corner. Then you're going to press this seam open and it'll practically disappear in your quilt. Once you have prepared the strip sets for each side of your quilt, now it's time to trim them to the measured size that you came up with originally, so that they fit the size of your quilt exactly. Before we get too excited about sewing on these borders, there's something real important you have to keep in mind. These are the side borders. That simply means we want these borders to go on the side of the center where the east and west motifs are, so that we're keeping the north and south at the top and bottom of the quilt. If you think back on our last lesson when we were assembling the center of the quilt, remember how we decided how we were going to position our pieces correctly? We did that by folding them in half and putting a pin in, and then folding it in quarters and putting another pin in each quarter. We're going to do the same thing here. On the center of the quilt, go ahead and half and quarter it. And you're going to do the same thing on your strip that you cut out of fabric A. Go ahead and center and quarter that. Now you're ready to pin it to your quilt. After you align the center and quarter pins, go ahead and insert the rest of your pins to secure it to that side. The method of quilt as you go that I'm going to show you this time is different than the first method that we used for the center of the quilt. This time we will have no sashing strips and no hand sewing. I know you'll miss that. So we're going to do the same thing with the backing fabric strip. We're going to half and quarter it, and we're going to pin it also to the center of the quilt. We're going to do that with the right side down against the backing. Then we're going to add the batting on top of that and pin it in place on top of the border strip. We are now ready to stitch all the layers together. So we have the center of the quilt, we have the backing strip, the batting strip, and also the strip that goes on the front. I find it easier if you stitch from the batting side because it helps to stabilize the whole unit and stitch your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and repeat this same process for the other side of your quilt. From the front side of your quilt, flip your strip over and press it firmly. Using steam helps here. Now turn your quilt over to the back side and repeat pressing the seam. And again, you want to steam it so it lays nice and flat. This sure beats hand stitching, doesn't it? To complete the side borders for your quilt, 1/2 and 1/4 your background fabric or color B, and then line it up to your first strip, which was color A. Matching the 1/2 and 1/4 pins, line it up, pin it together, and stitch again a 1/4 inch seam. When you're done with that, press the seam open, and just like that, your side borders are done. And now, thinking back to everybody's favorite part of this quilt, the buffets. Remember those? It's time to stitch them all together now in 2 groups of 13 each, so we can do the top and bottom borders. And then it's time for some math. If you recall, when we started this lesson, we did those series of measurements, the middle and on each side, and I came up with that 49-inch measurement. You might have something a little different. You need to write that measurement down, and then add to that 1 inch for each of the color A side borders. When we originally cut the strips for the side borders, they were 1.5 inches, but we've put a seam on each side of the color A border, so we're down to 1 inch now. As far as the color B side border, again, they started out at 1.5 inches, but we only have 1 seam on color B's side border, so we're down to 1.25 inches. We have to double that because we have borders on both sides, and that's why the numbers are showing as they are. Once you've added up all these numbers, write your measurement down. This is very important, and you'll be using this quite a bit. Some people do better with a visual, so here's the top of the quilt. There's an area between the orange stripes. That's what our original measurement was. Again, mine measured 49 inches. Add to that, each side has the orange band, which is reduced down to 1 inch because of the fact that we've got a seam on both sides. And then you have your final border, which only has 1 seam, so we've reduced that down to 1.25. But you have to account for both sides of the quilt. So with all that math out of the way, let's start cutting the fabric. Just as we did for the side borders, we're going to use color A and cut 3 strips 1.5 inches wide by the width of fabric. We're going to take that 3rd strip and cut it in half and sew it to each of the other lengths. You're going to then trim those 2 strips down to your original measurement. In my case, it was 49 plus 2.5 inches. So that would now be 51.5 inches total for me. To cut the wide bottom band, using color B, you need to cut 3 strips 5 inches wide by the width of the fabric. Again, you're going to split the 3rd strip and sew it to each of the other borders. Now, this is really important. You're going to now trim this wider border to your newly calculated measurement for this and the Bethette strips. And again, as an example, mine measured 53.5 inches. From the discarded piece of this border fabric, cut 4 pieces 1.5 inches square, and I'll explain what we'll do with those later. From your backing fabric, you need to cut 3 strips 11 inches wide times the width of the fabric. Again, we're going to split the 3rd strip and sew it to each of the other 2 strips to get the length that you need. You're going to trim this width of this, or the length of this strip, to the newly calculated measurement plus 6 inches. For your batting, you're going to cut 2 strips 11 inches wide by the newly calculated measurement plus 6 inches. So in my case, that was 53.5 inches plus 6. I now have to cut the batting 59.5 inches long. Now I know I'm guilty of explaining things to death sometimes, but I just want you to understand why we're doing what we're doing. If you were doing a normal quilt, you would be adding your borders to the side, the first set of borders, and then you would go ahead and add the borders to the top, making an allowance for the additional length that you would need for the top to cover the side borders, right? The same would hold true for the bottom border as well. So because we're doing the quilt as you go method, we have to again make allowances for the side borders we've already put on. So we would take our measurement and add on the measurement that would cover the 2 side borders, just like you normally would. But we also have to account for the second side border. That's where the 1.5 inch square comes in. You need to stitch that 1.5 inch square to the length of the top and bottom borders on each side. That will make that transition doable for quilt as you go. My calculations earlier took into account the seam allowance for these side borders. Okay, now that everybody's head is hurting because of the math, let's start stitching. After you have stitched on the 1.5 inch squares on both sides of your top border, let's go ahead and pin it right sides together to the top of your quilt. You'll do the same thing to the bottom. We'll be treating this first border for the top and bottom exactly the way we did on the sides. You're going to first half it and then quarter it and do the same thing with the quilt, and then matching those alignment points. In addition to the seam lines for the first border on the side pieces, pin everything in place. Continuing on, just like we did the sides, we're going to pin the backing strip to the back side of the quilt, right sides together, and again we're going to use the alignment of the half and the quarter to get that placed accurately. Notice that it does extend past the quilt just slightly. Laying the batting down on top of this strip, we're going to repin everything so that we have on the front side we have the first border, then we have the quilt, and then we have the backing piece, and then we have the batting, and we're ready to stitch through all layers. Again, it's easier if you stitch on the batting side. You may be wondering why we have a little bit of an overlap or an extension on the back piece and the batting. That's because this section of the quilt will be quilted, whereas the side pieces, because the bands are so narrow, will not be. This gives us a little handle while we're doing our quilting. After you're done stitching along the seam line with a 1/4 of an inch seam, you'll again go to the pressing board. You're going to press the front border up using a little steam. Now turn the quilt over to the back side and again press this seam towards the top, and again you want to steam it well so the seam lays nice and flat. You are now going to repeat the same sequence for the bottom of the quilt. And this is what the top should look like when you press that seam to the top. You'll notice that you have extra batting on both sides of your quilt. It's now time to take that wonderful row of bathettes and pin those in place. Now please notice that you will stop each row at the end of the sides. Let me show you the illustration. Bathettes are stopped right at the edge of the quilt where the border ends on the sides. Don't try to stretch them out of shape to reach the end of the backing and the batting. Just go to the end of the border. After your row of bathettes have been sewn on, you'll take them back to your pressing surface and using a generous amount of steam, press the bathettes to the front and steam it nice and flat. This wide bottom band is the last part of the assembly of this quilt. We're going to treat it just like we've done all the rest of them. We're going to hit. You'll want to half this and 1/4 it just like we have done all along and pin it to the row of bathettes. Stitch it in place. After it's stitched, take it to your pressing surface and press it open. We're getting down to the wire now. The only thing we have to do is to finish the quilting on the top and bottom borders and put on the binding. We sure have come a long way since we started our journey back at the end of December of last year. I think you've learned a lot, and I'm really proud of all your progress. Join us next time for our final lesson on our paper-pieced block of the month, and that session will be quilting the top and bottom bands, and then you'll be done. I'll see you then.